president of the AfDB, permit me to extend all other courtesies and protocols. I actually was expecting to be called after the president of the AfDB, so I'm a little unprepared to go ahead, but I think it's kind of him to permit me to make my hopefully brief remarks as I have to attend to another engagement outside of Abuja. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Nigeria for this important African Economic Conference. The theme of this conference, Feed Africa Towards Agro-Allied Industrialization, is very timely. The global commodity price shocks with the sharp decline in the price of oil have had major negative impact on the economies of several African countries. Nigeria, of course, is no exception. Because oil accounts for over 70% of government revenue and over 90% of foreign exchange earnings, shocks to global oil prices have significant effects on the Nigerian economy. But in our peculiar case, the vandalization of oil facilities, resulting at some point in the loss of over 1 million barrels of oil a day, clearly worsened our situation. As a result, Nigeria has witnessed in the past few months a sharp decline in economic growth. But we're determined to come out of the oil price and production shock-induced recession. We are working to expand our share of non-oil revenues, expanding the fiscal space, closing leakages, enhancing transparency and accountability in the management of public finances. But this will not be enough. Even when we get growth back on track, we must ensure that growth is inclusive and that it touches the lives of millions of Nigerians in rural areas who depend on agriculture as a source of their livelihoods. The key part of the solution, therefore, must be to rapidly raise the productivity of agriculture, reduce our dependency on food imports, and expand foreign exchange earnings from export-oriented agricultural products. Nigeria has comparative advantage in agriculture with vast amounts of arable land and good agro-ecological environments. And as a government, we are continuing policies to increase food production. The increased food output will help government to address food security and to provide decent quality meals for kids in school through our homegrown school feeding program. The government also, through its Anchor Borrowers Program, has launched a massive effort to expand rice production to reduce Nigeria's dependence on rice imports, which puts high pressure on our foreign exchange earnings. The private sector, of course, needs to play a significant role to link farm and agri-businesses, connecting food production, logistics, food processing, and agro-allied industries. As government, we are working on incentives to support the private sector in agro-industrial development. Just last week, I was at some factories, some agro-allied factories in Anambra State, and also in Lagos State. In Anambra State, I was at the Boko Bros plants. I was also looking at some of the work that's been done around palm kernel in some of the agro-allied factories in Ogun State. I also looked at the Honeywell food and agro-allied plant, where they have a sorghum flour mill and a feed mill as well. They're also doing a wheat processing mill there. In the same vicinity, Lad Group is doing possibly the largest shea butter plant in Africa. But I'll just talk a bit about just one example of some of the issues around the agro-allied type industries that we have seen and what exactly is happening in some of them. In about an hour from now, I'll be going to Kano State to visit the Sonny Dangote tomato paste factory, which is one of those private sector agro-allied efforts that we're trying to support. We had decided as part of our strategic implementation plan for this year to prioritize the processing of tomato paste so as to become self-sufficient in that particular product. The choice of tomato paste was predicated on our ability to produce tomatoes in large quantities several times a year, as well as its extensive use, of course, in Nigerian meals. We also saw it as an opportunity to generate a large number of agricultural jobs, but also as a means of adding value along the agro-allied chain. But we found, and which speaks to the importance of this conference, is that there are many factors that affect our national aspirations in this area. Some of these issues start at the farm, such as the need to plant the appropriate quality of the fruit to be used for processing. Now, this, of course, meant drawing on research, but also ensuring that the right seeds are available to farmers and at the right time, and also that fertilizers are available and also at the right time. And of course, this past year, no one factored in tuta absoluta. In fact, I didn't even know that such a thing existed until it struck the tomato plants. Of course, all our huge expectations around the harvest of that particular crop. But quick and effective response to that problem also is one of the issues that arose around that. But the Honorable Minister of Agriculture, I'm sure, will be able to probably talk a bit more about those issues. Then there's the issue of uptake and storage. Several of our large commercial farms have outgrower schemes that will buy the produce from their surrounding small-scale farmers. However, a lot of small-scale farmers are not linked to large farms, so they face the problems of transportation, storage, especially where the tomatoes, of course, are ripe. That poses additional challenges. At factory level, after ensuring that the quality of the tomatoes purchased are suitable for conversion into paste, operators still have to contend with issues of infrastructure, especially power generation. This is a very important issue because it goes to the very heart of being competitive against imports from other parts of the world which have penetrated the market. Indeed, that trade dimension is one that is particularly critical because of dumping and smuggling, which make it very difficult for our tomato factories to compete. We accordingly have to calibrate appropriate levels of support and protection for this sector. Of course, that involves, looking at the whole, myriad of trade rules and agreements and all of that. But there is a real danger that even with the best efforts, with production and all of that, the tomato industry may not be competitive against imports and dumping and the fair amount of smuggling that's going on. So these are some of the issues, of course, that we have to deal with. Indeed, some of our manufacturers find it expedient to focus on packaging imported concentrate, which saves the trouble of trying to compete with tomato paste from abroad. But of course, that means that you cut out the farming community entirely. And really, that doesn't make sense from the point of view of our own plans to expand the agricultural base and at the same time, create opportunities around processing and the entire value chain. Another element which our tomato farmers experience, tomato farmers and tomato paste manufacturers have to contend with include the high cost of finance, which we're trying to mitigate through our development institutions like the Bank of Agriculture and the Bank of Industry. We also have a commercial farmers credit scheme, which is really for small-scale farmers, and access to that. We've been trying to expand the possibilities of access to that. Part of that is working through our Bank of Agriculture, trying to revitalize the Bank of Agriculture itself and, as it were, reinvent it so that it's much more able to give the kind of support, not just financial support, but also advice to the industry. I've outlined some of these issues in order to give a flavor of some of the issues that we're dealing with in just one agro-allied sector alone, and I expect, hopefully that the outcome of your discussions will throw more light and give policy prescriptions on some of these issues.
That more than our next speaker. So as we move along in the program, I'd like to now welcome Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the 8th elected president of the Africa Development Bank. Please put your hands together.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Your Excellency, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Chief Adu Ogbe, Minister of Agriculture. It's nice to see you here. Mr. Abdallah Hamdok, Dr. Hamdok, the Acting Executive Secretary of United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Mr. Adeyeye, Director, Regional Bureau of Africa for the United Nations Development Program, and of course, our distinguished Nobel laureate economist, Professor Eric Maskin from Harvard University. You're welcome. Please put your hands together for him. Distinguished guests, distinguished professors, I can see all of you here, colleagues from the bank. I see the ambassadors from France and several others that are here. Soyez le bienvenu. Your Excellency, Mr. Vice President, I would like to express to you my sincere appreciation for your taking the time to be here this morning. I am obviously very aware of the very tight schedule that you operate. And in fact, because he's not supposed to be actually here, he's supposed to be in Kano already in the air. But he told me that because he was going to be talking about tomatoes in Kano, he has to be here and tell you about tomatoes so that by the time he's back, he can offer you dinner with some tomatoes on it. So he's done a fantastic job this morning. Thank you very much. Let me welcome you all to this African Economic Conference being held in Abuja that has just been declared open by His Excellency, Mr. Vice President. Unlocking the potential of agro-industrial development all across of Africa is what this conference is all about. The choice of Nigeria to host this conference is significant, as you have heard very eloquently from His Excellency, Mr. Vice President. It is the most populous African country with enormous potential in agriculture, as he has also described. If well managed and sustained, Nigeria, I have no doubt, has the potential to become a global powerhouse through agro-industrialization. I am also delighted that Nobel Prize economist Professor Eric Maskin of Harvard University is here with us. He arrived just yesterday for this event, and immediately after this event, Nobel Prize winners are not easy to get. He'll be traveling straight away to Russia to give another talk. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as well on Africa's agricultural industrialization. Agriculture, which contributes over 28% of the GDP of Africa, holds the key for accelerated growth and diversification and job creation for African economies. No region of the world has moved to industrial economy status without passing through the transformation of the agricultural sector. The reason is simple. Agriculture provides the basic raw materials needed for industrial development. Food accounts for the highest share of consumers' price index, and providing cheap food is crucial for taming inflation. When inflation is low, interest rates decline, and it brings greater private sector investments. A more productive, efficient, and competitive agricultural sector is critical for boosting rural economies where a majority of the population live in Africa. Therefore, a more prosperous rural economy will drive jobs and accelerate rural savings, critical for inclusive growth. In short, the future of Africa depends on agriculture. I'm sure nobody would be very happy to hear that than Chief Ogbe, who is the Minister of Agriculture. So I might as well put a pitch in, Mr. Vice President, for his budget to be increased so he can do more. However, the performance of the sector in Africa has been low. Cereal yields and use of modern farm inputs, including improved seeds, mechanization, and irrigation, fall way below global average. The sector is still dominated by a large number of subsistence farmers. It suffers from low levels of public investment, including access to finance for farmers and agribusinesses. To be clear, agriculture has largely been seen as a development sector for managing poverty, not for creating wealth. Yet, Africa sits on a huge potential in agriculture. It is estimated that 65% of all the uncultivated arable land left in the world that would feed 9 billion people by 2050 lies in Africa. So, what Africa does with agriculture will also shape the future of food globally. Africa today spends $35 billion annually importing food. As it does, it decimates its own agriculture. It spends scarce foreign exchange importing what it can and what it should produce. It exports jobs and makes itself subject to price effects from global commodity supply shocks. Estimates show that food and agribusiness sector is projected to grow from $330 billion today to $1 trillion by 2030. The key is to unlock this opportunity. And it must start with treating agriculture as a business. It must start with taking a full value chain approach to modernize agriculture from the farm to the table. And it must start with supporting agro-industrial development. The time is therefore short. Was in serious rural and urban poverty just 50 years ago, but not now. Korea's per capita GDP is now 17 times that of sub-Saharan Africa, while its total GDP is $1.3 trillion compared to $1.6 trillion for sub-Saharan Africa. Korea today is the 11th largest economy in the world. Think about it. And is a generous donor of development finance. It is such an extraordinary success story. But it wasn't a miracle. It came from many factors that came together. Strong political commitment and determination, solid long-term planning and execution, structural transformation policies, and robust investments in human capital. There was a clear plan. Drive import substitution by raising agricultural productivity through industrialization to achieve food self-sufficiency. More generally, the successful Asian experience offers us today important lessons for agro-industrialization. Today, Asia's agricultural output is led by large private agribusiness enterprises engaged in industrial agriculture, and you heard from the Excellency Mr. Vice President about Nigeria's effort to drive in that direction. Agricultural output per worker has risen in Asia by an average of 2.2% per year from 1980 to 2010, compared to only 0.6% in sub-Saharan Africa. There is no denying the fact that without the Green Revolution, Asia could not have become the industrial and economic giant that it is today. This is the formula. Agriculture, allied with industry, manufacturing, and processing capability, equals strong and sustainable economic development and wealth creation throughout the economy. Africa must not miss opportunities for such linkages whenever they knock at the doors. Let's take the case of the current decline in commodity prices. This is not the first time that such events will occur. But whenever they do occur, African countries always sing the same song. We need to diversify. Well, diversification is not a goal. It is the outcome of well-planned policies for the structural transformation of economies. When I was minister in Nigeria, we moved aggressively on import substitution with the use of cassava flour for use as composite flour in bread making and confectionery industries. People laughed us to scorn, as you can imagine. Nigerians, they said, will never eat bread made from cassava flour. Well, unknown to Nigerians, flour millers, small, medium, and large, have now all shifted to partial substitution of wheat flour with cassava composite flours. So don't look for cassava bread. All your bread is now cassava composite flour based. The industry has shifted. The story is not just in Nigeria. As we speak, several countries have taken the homegrown policy right from here in Nigeria to help reduce their wheat imports, including Liberia, Togo, and Democratic Republic of Congo. In DRC, young graduate entrepreneurs from the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture have taken the business of cassava flour for bread and confectionaries. If you wish, you may laugh. But let me assure you, these young entrepreneurs are laughing their ways to the bank as we speak. On Friday last week, I had the pleasure of receiving a large delegation of these young agricultural entrepreneurs from IITA. A young graduate called Nobel from Bukavu in DRC, Congo, together with his colleagues, have moved into agribusiness. In just a little over a year, they manufacture cassava flour, well packaged and standardized for bakers. Today, Noel and his team generate $4,000 per week. $4,000 per week, or $16,000 a month, or $196,000 a year. That means they are making 78 million naira annually if converted into naira at the official interbank market rate. They are already multi-millionaires. He that has ears, let him hear. The key for Africa's prosperity is value addition in agriculture, in turning our own local products into money. In looking inwards, Africa must feed itself. The technologies to feed Africa exist already. High-yielding, drought-tolerant maize can allow farmers to get a good crop in drought situations, and you know we are in a period of climate change. Cassava varieties can now get farmers up to 80 tons per hectare. High-yielding rice varieties that meet and beat international standards of imported rice now exist. And I want to particularly thank the Honorable Minister of Agriculture for the great work that's been done by him and the Central Bank of Nigeria on the Anchor program on rice production in northern Nigeria using those varieties. Please put your hands together for them. They're doing a great job. Orange flesh sweet potatoes that can allow us to address the problem of vitamin A deficiency now exist. Tropical and drought-tolerant wheat varieties are unleashing a wheat revolution in northern Nigeria, Kenya, and Sudan. What is needed is taking these technologies to scale, allow them to use all of these new technologies. We pursued this in Nigeria, and it worked very well. Using the power of mobile phones, Nigeria developed and used electronic wallet systems to deliver farm input support to farmers through electronic vouchers on their mobile phones. Nigeria became the first country globally to do so, and the impact was massive. Over 4 years, over 14.5 million farmers were reached. Impact on food production was massive, with food production expanding by over 21 million tons over the period. I'm particularly excited that the system reached 2.5 million women farmers. To be clear, the system was a bottom-up fiscal stimulus that touched multiple parts of the economy: seed companies, fertilizer companies, agro dealers, banks, transport and logistic companies, and mobile phone companies. We need these kinds of bottom-up fiscal policy support for farmers in Africa everywhere. Today, several African countries are adopting this approach, even as far-flung as in Afghanistan. I am very pleased that Nigeria will be continuing this program, and just before I entered this particular hall, I was in discussion with the Minister of Agriculture, who told me of the success they are having in the north, and in fact how much of the food is now leaving Nigeria because they are continuing to support farmers. It is very critical that we ensure more rapid and inclusive bottom-up growth while promoting private sector and bank financing into the agriculture sector. To take new agricultural technologies to scale, the African Development Bank will soon be launching an $800 million initiative called Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, otherwise called TAAT, with the goal of reaching over 40 million farmers over 10 years. We must equally reduce the food system losses all along the value chain, from the farm, storage, transport, processing, and marketing. Professor Oshibajo, I know that you are a lawyer. I didn't realize that you have become such an expert in agriculture the way you explained the value chain for tomato just this morning. Food and agribusiness companies have little incentives to set up in rural areas. Poor infrastructure, especially the lack of access to electricity, roads, rail transport, and water, drive up their cost of doing business. What is needed is the development of large staple crop processing zones and agro-industrial zones, enabled with infrastructure such as power, water, and roads. This will drive down the cost of doing business, as well as significantly reduce post-harvest losses all across Africa. The African Development Bank will invest in the development of these staple crop processing zones and agro-industrial zones. The experience from Asia, especially China, on such special economic zones have a lot to offer to African countries. Africa must turn agriculture into wealth and move out of exporting basic raw materials. Times are changing. So are the opportunities. For example, where global firms source their apparels is changing rapidly today, due in part to rising industrial wages in China, security and political uncertainties in leading suppliers such as Turkey and Bangladesh. This presents a unique opportunity for Africa to take its place in the global textile and apparel value chains. Because of cotton production in Africa, it is possible to go from cotton to textile and to garments in one single place, an advantage Asian countries do not have. These present excellent opportunities for vertical integration. Ethiopia has achieved remarkable success with industrial parks for cotton, textile, and garments. Today, as we speak, some 20 global companies are engaged on developing its cotton, textile, and garment sector. Ethiopia expects to make $1 billion a year from textile and garments from just one industrial park, and they plan to do 14 of them. Africa, ladies and gentlemen, should be exporting processed cocoa, not cocoa beans. It should be exporting specialized ground African coffee instead of generic coffee beans. And it should be exporting finished textile products such as clothes, suits, dresses, shirts, not cotton lint. The remarkable progress of Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, Ethiopia, Tunisia, and Morocco on the global horticulture industry shows that with well-designed policies, financing, and infrastructure, Africa can climb to the top of global value chains. We must also solve the challenge of access to finance, to expand access to finance for farmers and agribusinesses with commercial financing. Risk-sharing instruments will play a crucial role in this with regard to sharing risk of lending with commercial banks to the agriculture sector. Finance and farming, I'm sure the Minister of Agriculture will be the first to tell you, have not always been great partners. Agriculture, with all the share of the economy it has only 3% of the total bank lending that we have in Africa today, and that's not possible. That requires that we look for innovative approaches. Don't look further, just look at what Nigeria has done. When I was here with the Central Bank of Nigeria, the lesson, ladies and gentlemen, is clear. Development finance institutions and multilateral development banks like ourselves should be setting up national risk-sharing facilities in every country to leverage agricultural finance into this sector. To drive agro-industrialization, we must be able to finance this sector. Doing so will unlock the potential of agriculture as a business on the continent. That is why, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, under its Feed Africa strategy, the African Development Bank will invest $24 billion into agriculture and agribusiness over the next 10 years. And you can understand why. I am president of the bank, and I happen to have an agricultural background. Our goal is simple: support massive agro-industrial development all across Africa. To make this happen, there is need for well-directed public policies to incentivize the agricultural sector, especially agribusiness and food manufacturing companies. And when this happens, Africa will have turned the corner and taken its rightful place as a global powerhouse in food and agriculture. Now our task is to make it happen, and I have no doubt that we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adeshino. Quite a few useful points to take away, and one that I thought was really interesting was the point he made about diversification, that diversification is not a goal, but is the outcome of well-thought transformational policies. And indeed, that's what it's going to take for us to take agriculture to the next level on the continent. Now, to give us some more perspective on some well-thought diversification policies, because indeed he does know a thing or two about it, I'd like to welcome, okay, can we please rise as the Vice President takes his leave at this time? Really appreciate the fact that you came, Your Excellency. Thank you very much for that. Please be seated. All right. Well, the President of the Africa Development Bank has escorted him out. I'm sure he will join us in a moment, but I think we should go on to hear from our next speaker to give some opening remarks. He's Abdallah Hamdok. Abdallah Hamdok is the Acting Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and he's a policy analyst and economist with over 25 years experience in addressing development challenges in Africa at the national, sub-regional, and continent-wide levels. He most recently served as the director of the sub-regional and director of the Governance and Public Administration Division of the Commission in Africa. And he also served as principal policy economist at the ADB previously. And from 1981 to 1987, he was a senior official with the government of Sudan in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together as we hear some very interesting remarks about the agricultural sector in Africa, Mr. Abdallah Hamdok.
Good morning, Sabah al-Khair. Maybe it's in order for me to recognize His Excellency Professor Yemi Osinbajo, the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Dr. Adeshina, President of the African Development Bank Group, my brother Abdullah Imadi, Director, UNDP Africa, Excellencies, Ministers, Ambassadors, Head of Missions, colleagues from the three institutions, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to welcome you all to this very important conference taking place here in Nigeria, the heartbeat of the African continent. Allow me to sincerely thank the government and people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria for their generosity, warm welcome, and for hosting the 2016 conference. I also wish to thank our partners, the African Development Bank, AEC ongoing structural transformation campaign for the continent to promote accelerated, sustained, and inclusive growth and development as articulated in Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063, and other agreed continental and global development agenda. Since the turn of the century, Africa made notable gains on growth and productivity, underpinned by improved economic governance and steady though slow diversification. Yet, as we all know, progress towards Africa's social development goals remains slow. in particular, unemployment, poverty, and inequality rates, as well as food insecurity, remain high and must be addressed as a matter of priority if the continent is to avoid reversals. Excellencies, distinguished participants, the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in October 2015, rather September, clearly underscore and emphasize the need to leave no one behind. Part of this commitment is making sure that success and access to food is a fundamental right of everyone on this planet, becomes a reality as clearly formulated under SDG 2. We need to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. To achieve these objectives, Africa needs a new policy approach in order to influence the nature and the pace of structural shifts, as well as the scale and distribution of benefits, starting from an overwhelmingly agrarian society where the agricultural sector employed more than 85% of the labor force and contributed over 60% of GDP in most African countries in the 60s. Today, the picture is not that very different. Agriculture contributes less than 40% of GDP, but still employs disproportionately higher percentage, more than 60% of the labor force in most of our countries. This is a grave reminder that national policy interventions should not only focus on incentivizing movement of factors of production towards activities and sectors with higher returns, but also seeks to improve the productivity of traditional mainstay sector of the economy, which remain the main source of livelihood for more than 55% of African population. Within agriculture, therefore, lies our natural comparative advantage to pursue commodity-based industrialization. Transformative and inclusive development has been Africa's key objectives since independence around the early 60s. If we properly recall that as early as 1962, the ECA advised that this aspiration was possible and could indeed be achieved through a significant shift of the workforce to more productive activities, while investments were channeled towards boosting productivity of all sectors. Africa's development challenge, therefore, has historically been on how to incentivize movement of the labor force and investment into higher value activities within and across sectors, including agriculture, in order to foster inclusive and sustainable development. Through various editions of our economic report on Africa, we at ECA have consistently highlighted the need for a developmental state that plans to foster Africa's structural transformation, benefiting from the continent's natural resources endowment, to promote industrialization, and particularly agro-allied and commodity-based industrialization, and export diversification through dynamic industrial policies. Indeed, the desired structural transformation will not be realized without strong and inclusive institutions backed by well-coordinated developmental plans supported by innovative and flexible industrial policy. The premier institution, the African Union, has put forward this impressive and rather very ambitious plan of 2063. Agricultural-based industrialization is an imperative for Africa's desired structural transformation framework. Therefore, agro-allied industrialization should essentially be developmental, targeting local content measures with specific emphasis on skills development, technological capabilities, and access to capital and markets, as well as buyer-supplier cooperation at every stage of the value chain. President Adesina mentioned the Korean experience. It is actually precisely built on economic activism and building capabilities. It is equally important for the policy framework to be based on a good understanding of the global dynamics, including power structures, new shifts in trading patterns and partners, and the various barriers and preferences characterizing the global landscape. In this context, boosting inter-Africa trade remains imperative for creating the markets needed for successful agro-allied industrialization and providing opportunities for learning and innovation which is beyond individual nation state. Let me stress here the need for a leadership that provides a clear vision on agro-allied industrialization, its articulation within an overall development plan based on broad mobilization of different stakeholders in society, including the private sector and local communities. I would argue that this vision would only be realized through a democratic developmental state that endeavor to strengthen bureaucratic capacity to undertake dynamic long-term planning and the coordination of economic activities based on robust monitoring and evaluation system to better measure and monitor progress, prioritize domestic resource mobilization as the main means of financing development, while being true to the Pan-African principles in accelerating the pace of regional integration. I think the continent has absolutely decided on the regional integration agenda. The difference is between those who want to go very fast and those who want to go fast enough. In this context, it is important to focus on regional integration to enhance horizontal as well as vertical linkages in value chain development. Supporting regional value chain development requires strong cross-country collaboration and government commitment to implement agreed plans. This harmonization of policies and legal frameworks, as well as institutional arrangement that promote regional infrastructure and the movement of people and goods. These arrangements should clearly indicate how the benefits and costs related to value chain development would be shared. Excellencies, distinguished participants, as we embark on the process of agro-allied industrialization, we cannot be oblivious of the challenges of African industrialization. The industrial sector contribution to GDP of about 29% today is dominated by primary commodity production. Here we can see the critical role of agricultural contribution to industrialization through the several key linkages such as provision of food and raw material to non-agricultural sector, creation of effective demand for products of non-agricultural sector, contributing to investable surpluses through savings and taxes, as well as foreign exchange earnings through agricultural export, in addition to employment of vast many of our people in the rural labor market. Sector-specific policies for transforming agriculture are crucial for achieving food security and reducing hunger, as well as for job creation and trade. Enormous consultations have resulted in a number of regionally agreed commitments, such as CARIP, CIRT Declaration, Abuja Declaration, and many others. However, the implementation of these commitments has not been as successful as has been anticipated. And I think this is probably one of the major problems or challenges for our continent. We are not short of frameworks, agreements, and that sort of thing. The main challenge is really the implementation. If you look at the African Union, I think every summit we approve probably between 40 to 50 resolutions, but I don't see any progress in the implementation. So this is really where the challenge lies. Accelerating agricultural development in the context of regionally integrated value chains will require prioritizing, institutionalizing, and operationalizing these commitments, addressing key challenges to agricultural development, and promoting viable value chains by both public and private sectors at the national, regional, continental, and global level. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, this conference provides us with a golden opportunity to support the various pillars of Africa's agro-allied industrialization by sharing best practices and experiences on how to achieve our collective goal of transformative, equitable, and inclusive development in our beloved continent. I am sure the research and evidence-based analysis which will be presented in these coming days will enhance our understanding on how the continent may transform its agro-industrial sector to feed and generate prosperity for all the African people. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Many thanks for that. I think one key takeaway for me was what is obvious. Africa needs a new policy approach with respect to agriculture, and leadership is really what will make the difference. Leadership with clear vision for agro-industrialization. And events like this obviously give us an opportunity to learn from each other. And as we move on, I'd like to now welcome to the podium to make his opening remarks Abdoulaye Mar Dieye. He's Assistant Administrator and Director of the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa by the United Nations Secretary General, and he has been in that role since 2013. He was previously the Chief of Staff and Director of the UNDP's Executive Office, and until 2009, he was Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Regional Director of the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Arab States. Previously, he worked with the government of Senegal as Chief of the General Planning Division and Inspector General in the Ministry of Planning and Cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Abdoulaye Mar Dieye.
Thank you. Change my glasses. Thank you, MC. Acting Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Professor Eric Maskin, Nobel laureate in economics, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to attend the 11th edition of the African Economic Conference on the theme, Feeding Africa Towards Agro-Allied Industrialization for Inclusive Growth. I treasure these annual gatherings co-organized by ADB, ECA, and UNDP. I do not want to miss them. They are powerful moments when brilliant minds working on African economies coalesce and exchange ideas to inform better economic policies.
This year's meeting is very topical and timely. If we want to leave no one behind, as advocated in Agenda 2030, we must then feed the continent first. It is a basic human right. It is a development imperative. I would like to also recognize the presence of Professor Eric Maskin, who has done seminal work on mechanisms that are alternatives to the market. His contribution, I am sure and confident, will greatly shape the outcome of our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, it is fitting that we are having this meeting here in Nigeria, a country that is successfully implementing its very innovative agricultural transformation agenda, ATA. This agenda aims at addressing two paradoxes that many African countries are also facing. The paradox of food insecurity in the midst of fertile but uncultivated arable land, and the paradox of a weak linkage between agriculture and industry in the midst of unexploited opportunities. Let me begin by articulating the first paradox, the paradox of Africa's failing agrarian economies that are unable to meet its food security needs. African economies are still largely agrarian, contributing, and we have heard it, close to 1/5 of GDP and accounting for 7 out of 10 people employed in countries on the continent. To quote Kofi Annan, Africa is a potential global agricultural powerhouse. Since our independence, over the past 6 decades, we have not succeeded in translating. About 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa still suffer from hunger. Instead of being a net exporter, we are a net importer of food, spending some 35 billion of our scarce foreign exchanges annually. 3 main factors account for Africans' agriculture's underperformance and low productivity. First, a large proportion of Africa's agriculture depends on rain. Only 6% of the total cultivated area in Africa is equipped for irrigation, compared to 46% in South Asia and 56% in East Asia. Second, slow growth in productivity, which account currently for 1/3 of the world average, is a binding factor. This is mainly due to Africa's underinvestment or undercapitalization in terms of technology, information, infrastructure, and fractured markets. Third, urban biased development policies exacerbate rural poverty. It leads to rural-urban migration, increased supportive institutions. It will take accommodating social norms, and it will take balanced international agreements and world governance on agricultural matters. It means for us here that we have to go beyond the usual mechanics of the economic policies of agriculture and investigate the complexities of the political economy of agriculture. There, in my sense, lies the way to the Golden Gate, because that's where the major binding constraints are locked and are sleeping. I challenge the economists and policymakers attending this conference to guide us in unlocking those constraints. I have the highest confidence that they will. I wish a great success to our meeting, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mardieye. Very, very useful points as well. A lot of food for thought, and we'll be getting a lot more as we move along in the conference. I would like to get some really interesting perspective on agriculture now, and our next speaker is very qualified to offer that. Laying the foundation and other areas of economics. He received his PhD from Harvard and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Jesus College in Cambridge University. He's a member of the Harvard faculty. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Eric Maskin for a special presentation, very special presentation.
It's really a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to participate in the African Economic Conference. This is my fourth time in Nigeria, the first time to Abuja. I would like to thank the African Development Bank for their very kind invitation. And what I thought I would do this morning is to take a few minutes to tell you about some work that I've been doing about and income inequality in developing countries. And as you will see, this has quite a lot to do with agriculture. We have been going through an intense period of globalization in the last 20 or 30 years. And globalization has brought with it many benefits. Developing countries like China, India, and a number of African countries have seen dramatic input as a result of globalization. But globalization has also brought with it some difficulties. In particular, it has led to an increase, a fairly dramatic increase in inequality in a number of developing countries, China, India, and a number of African countries are examples of this as well. Is that exactly the opposite should have happened. Developing countries are rich in unskilled labor. And when a country embarks in international trade, it tends to specialize in goods which make use of skilled labor. It's going to concentrate on goods that make a lot of use of unskilled labor, and that will be good for the unskilled workers because they will be in greater demand, they will see their wages rise, and as a result we can expect inequality to decrease. That at least is the theory, and that is what's in the last 20 or 30 years. Instead, we saw an increase in inequality. And the question is, why? What is wrong with the theory of comparative advantage? And that's where what we try to argue is that this particular globalization is different from earlier globalizations in that it's not only goods and services which are being traded across international boundaries, but the production process itself. Computers might be designed in North America and programmed in Europe and assembled in China. The very process itself is international, and that means that the labor market itself grows as a result of this process. Well, that's our diagnosis of what has happened in the last are more fairly distributed, that they're not just going to people at the top, but also to people at the bottom. And the way to ensure a fairer distribution, we would bottom so that they get employment opportunities as well. This involves an investment in education. This involves an investment in modern skills. Of course, education and skill training are expensive, and the question arises, who is going to pay for them? Of course, they themselves. Of course, they would love to be able to do it, but they don't have the resources. You might say their employers should invest in training their workers. But as we see, employers don't always have sufficient incentive to make these investments. If I'm an unskilled worker and you're a potential would take one of your jobs, but then once I'm trained, I don't have to work for you. I could go and work for your competitor, in which case the investment that you've made in me is lost. And so that means that you may not have sufficient incentive to train me. That suggests that requires some outside party, some third party, such as government. Government needs to get involved in skill training and education. And here I'm thinking particularly of skill training and education in the agricultural area, because by, for example, giving subsidies to companies that are willing to train unskilled workers and give them training in modern techniques. You might say, well, how is human capital? And so, yes, there are other priorities too, but skill development should be the top priority. Well, that's very briefly the sort of work that I've been trying to do, and as I say, it's not a message at all. Rather, it's a message which says that globalization is a force which should be enjoyed by everybody, not just the people at the top. Let the fruits of globalization be shared equally.